Hi, Ozzy here. A few months ago, Matt Dillahunty, the outspoken atheist and one of the hosts of the Atheist Experience TV show, said something in one of his videos which I thought was particularly important with respect to how we understand the concept of atheism. He said it to Anthony Magnabosco, who's well known for his practice of street epistemology, during a one-on-one conversation on Matt's YouTube channel. If you're not familiar with either Matt Dillahunty or Anthony Magnabosco, I encourage you to visit their channels and check out some of their content. Links to both their channels are provided below, including a link to the conversation they had on Matt's channel. In this video, I want to explain what Matt Dillahunty was saying to Magnabosco, as I understand it, and why I agree with it. I hasten to add that what follows is my own understanding of Matt's reasoning, and it should not be taken as an authoritative statement about Matt's own view of the matter, as I've not had occasion to discuss it with him yet. But if he disagrees in any respect, I'd welcome his feedback on what I'm saying. So here's a short bit of the conversation between Anthony and Matt on the subject of agnosticism and atheism, and specifically about the label agnostic atheist. The first person you'll see speaking is Anthony, followed by Matt.
Like our understanding, even though we're probably on the same page with what an agnostic atheist is, there are thousands of different variations of that.
Well, I actually, even despite the fact that it appears on the Iron Chariots wiki, there's been so many conversations about it that I'm convinced that agnostic atheists, that particular label combination, doesn't make any sense because because knowledge being a subset of belief, if you're using atheism as I don't believe this, as opposed to atheism as I believe there are no gods. So agnostic atheist doesn't apply to atheist in the soft atheist context. It can only apply in the hard atheist context. Well, I actually, even despite the fact that it appears on the Iron Chariots wiki, there's been so many conversations about it that I'm convinced that agnostic atheists, that particular label combination, doesn't make any sense. I'm convinced that agnostic atheists, that particular label combination, doesn't make any sense.
So what I found particularly interesting was when Matt said, quote, "I'm convinced that agnostic atheists, that particular label combination, doesn't make any sense," end quote. And then immediately after he added, quote, "Agnostic atheist can only apply in the hard atheist context, not in the soft atheist context," end quote. Now, why does Matt say this? Well, he mentioned the two ways one might define atheism, hard atheism and soft atheism. And what he means here by hard atheism is sometimes called positive atheism, which is the more traditional and long-standing definition of atheism as the belief in the proposition that gods don't exist. While by soft atheism, he means the mere lack of a belief in theism, which would also include people who affirm gods don't exist, but would also include people who are undecided on the question, people who've never heard of a god and so have no opinion on the matter, etc. According to Matt, the expression agnostic atheist only makes sense if atheism is being understood in the hard or positive sense, not the soft or negative sense. Now, this is not to say that Matt is endorsing the hard sense of atheism over the soft definition, but what he is saying is that one cannot legitimately apply the term agnostic atheist to oneself if one is defining atheism in its soft sense, as a mere lack of a belief in theism. I think Matt Dillahunty is correct that the expression agnostic atheist cannot make sense unless what one is being agnostic about is a proposition, namely the proposition that a god doesn't exist. And this is because if atheism is defined as a mere lack of belief, then adding the modifier agnostic in front of it would mean that one is agnostic about the fact that one lacks a belief. But that wouldn't make any sense, because it would mean an agnostic atheist is claiming to lack knowledge about whether he or she even lacks a belief. That is, if you think atheism is something you can be Gnostic or agnostic about, and you also think that atheism means the lack of a belief in a God or gods. It would mean that what your agnosticism or Gnosticism refers to is your lack of a belief in a God or gods. But if you call yourself an agnostic atheist, as so many online atheists like to label themselves, are you really unsure about whether you lack a belief? Do you think maybe you don't lack a belief and that perhaps you do have a belief in God? Because that's what it would mean to be agnostic about your lack of a belief. But I think, and what Matt Dillahunty was implying in that video, is that if you're an agnostic atheist, clearly what you're agnostic about isn't whether or not you lack a belief. Rather, what you're agnostic about is the claim that there's no God. That is to say, the atheism about which you are being agnostic is the traditional definition of atheism that's been in vernacular and technical use for centuries in all modern languages, namely, the proposition that there's no God. That's what you're agnostic about. Now there's an irony here, since the very people who espouse the label agnostic atheists are almost invariably the very people who repudiate the claim that atheism is the position that there's no gods, but rather is a mere lack of a belief. So, if you're an agnostic atheist, either you're an agnostic about the claim that there is no God, which means you're implicitly defining atheism as the proposition that there's no God, or else you're going to have to admit that your agnosticism isn't about that claim, but that what you're agnostic about is your own lack of a belief that a God exists. So which is it? Are you undecided about your own lack of belief? If you're not undecided, if you're not agnostic about whether or not you lack a belief, then what is it that you're agnostic about? Well, it's obvious what you're agnostic about. It's the claim that there's no God. That's the claim about which you're agnostic. But that means your label of agnostic atheist only makes sense, as Matt explained, if what you're agnostic about is atheism understood as a claim about God's non-existence. So, does the label agnostic atheism make any sense? Well, yes, provided what you mean by atheism is the positive assertion that there aren't any gods. But if what you mean by atheism is lacktheism, the mere lack of a belief in a God or gods, then calling yourself an agnostic atheist doesn't make sense, since it would mean that what you're agnostic about is whether you lack a belief, which means you think that perhaps you might be a believer. And that, I'm sure, is not what proponents of the lacktheist definition mean to say when they call themselves agnostic atheists. They're trying to say that they're agnostic about a certain claim about reality, the claim that reality includes no gods. That's what they're agnostic about. Not agnostic about their own mental state, and that they might believe but don't know whether they believe or not. So why does this matter? Why does it matter if a person who self-identifies as an agnostic atheist defines atheism in its positive or hard form, as a belief in the proposition that gods don't exist, as opposed to in its negative or soft form, which I've termed lacktheism, the mere lack of a belief in any god or gods? Why does it matter? Well, I think it matters if you want to be taken seriously on the subject of your atheism and want to be unambiguous about what your own stance is. When proponents of the lacktheist definition of atheism call themselves agnostic atheists, they are, without realizing it, equivocating about the word atheism. When asked what atheism is, proponents of lacktheism define atheism as a lack of a belief in a god or gods. But when asked what their own position is, most of them adopt a label, agnostic atheist, which only makes sense if atheism is being understood as the view that there's no God, and that what they are agnostic about is the positive assertion about the non-existence of gods. Most proponents of lacktheism haven't noticed this obvious fallacy of equivocation between how they define atheism and how they self-label. Since most atheist activists like to think of themselves, as I do, as proponents of critical thinking, I think we're wise to avoid this sort of equivocation, especially when the label agnostic atheism simply makes no sense when atheism is understood as mere lack theism. Okay, that's all for now. Thanks for watching.